This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 834 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. As a reminder, I do other things outside of this podcast. I mean, with fantasy football analysis. There's the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon, where you can get rest of season rankings and tiers, weekly rankings and tiers, data dumps, live Q&As, and more. You can use the Patreon month to month if need be. It's $10 a month. Like I've been saying, I'm just trying to make a living here. I'm not trying to take all of your money. Check it out, though, by heading to lateround.com. Sell Najee Harris. Now, I wouldn't doubt that if you talk to fantasy football managers, that they would think that Najee Harris is having this horrible fantasy season, because anchoring bias is a very real thing. Harris started off his season really bad. He averaged 6.7 PPR points per game from week 1 to week 5. Everyone probably thinks that that's the way that his season has gone. But the Steelers had their bye in week 6. And since that bye, Najee Harris hasn't been that bad in fantasy football. Over his last 4 outings, he scored no fewer than 10.5 PPR points. He's averaging 15.1 PPR points per game. Now, what's kind of interesting about this is that this exact same thing happened in 2022. Before Pittsburgh's bye last year, Harris had 10.9 PPR points per game. That was his average. That shot up to 15.2 after the bye. And to be clear, out of the bye week for Najee Harris, his workload has gotten better. During his bad opening stretch, he was averaging a running back rush share per game of about 65%. His target share per game was under 6%. But during his last 4 games, that running back rush share, it's dropped by about 5 percentage points. But what's way more important is that his target share per game during this really good stretch, or this better stretch, is 14.4%. So his target share has jumped by over 8 percentage points. And I'll say this, if we were guaranteed that type of target share from here on out, if we were guaranteed this workload from Najee Harris from now through the end of the season, he wouldn't be a sell candidate. I'm just not sure that this is that sustainable. According to Next Gen Stats data, during the first 5 weeks of the season, Najee Harris was seeing a target on about 13% of his routes run. That ranked in just the 14th percentile among relevant running backs. Now, over his last 4 games where he's had this 14.4% target share, that number shot up to 33%. Of the 50 running backs with 40 or more routes run during this stretch, only Aaron Jones has seen a higher targets per route run rate. Harris has seen more targets per route run than Alvin freaking Kamara. That, to me, everyone, is unsustainable. And we have evidence that it's not sustainable, not just because of what he did to start this season, but what he's done during his career. His targets per route run rate is 19% throughout his career before 2023. And let's not ignore his touchdown production either. He's now scored in 3 of his last 4 games. That's boosting his point totals. Now here's the thing. If you have Najee Harris and you're looking good for the playoffs, you might want to hold rather than sell because their playoff schedule really isn't that bad. But if you need to win right now, this might be the time to sell Najee Harris, especially because the Steelers get the Browns this week. But again, if your league mates are sort of anchored to this idea that Harris has not been very good in fantasy football, maybe he is just more of a hold than a sell. But if they understand how he's been performing, then you might be able to sell high. Add Ty Chandler. So this is a repeat transaction from last week, but things have changed in that Minnesota backfield, so it needs to be reiterated. Ty Chandler still rostered in just 8% of Yahoo leagues. But it's important because Alexander Madison's concussed. And players who are concussed tend to sit out at least a game. And that could lead to a lot more Ty Chandler in week 11 against the Broncos. But even before that concussion occurred for Alexander Madison, Chandler was seeing more work in that Vikings backfield, at least compared to how things looked earlier on in the season when he was the number 2 back. Now, this is according to my friend Jim Sonis over at FanDuel. But before Alexander Madison had that concussion, he was out-snapping Ty Chandler 30-17 in that backfield, which is a lot closer than it was earlier this season. Both players had 8 attempts on the ground. Madison had 2 targets, Chandler had 0. So what I'm saying here is there's a chance that Chandler's a flex-worthy player even when Alexander Madison's healthy. And they've got a great rest of season schedule too. But with the concussion, he should see an increased workload in week 11. He's a must-add this week. Hold Noah Brown. When big performances come from unlikely players like we've seen with Noah Brown, fantasy managers usually try to sell. They try to sell the players high. But through the years, I've learned that doing that is easier said than done. Realistically, yeah, Noah Brown is probably a sell candidate. He's played 5 games this season, and he's maxed out at a good but not great 20.8% target share. More importantly, the Texans haven't played a game since week 1 with their 4 main wide receivers active and healthy. Those 4 being Noah Brown, Tank Dell, Robert Woods, and Nico Collins. And back in week 1, Tank Dell hadn't shown what he can do. Brown was playing ahead of Dell. We shouldn't bank on that happening moving forward. When all 4 of these players are healthy, my guess is that Brown and Robert Woods are going to rotate out of the slot. Either that or all 4 of these players are going to see a decrease in snap count. Now, there's a chance that Brown just overtakes Woods, but I think Woods is still a capable pass catcher. I think they still like Robert Woods. This is basically all to say that the Texans' passing attack, while it's incredibly good because of C.J. Stroud and how awesome he's been, it could be obnoxious at times down the stretch. I think this is more geared towards Noah Brown and Robert Woods than is Tank Dell and Nico Collins. But ask yourself, is anyone really buying Noah Brown right now? Are they really trading for him after he posted 153 and 172 yards in back-to-back games? Again, if they are, I do think that he's a hypothetical sell. But if you want an optimistic view, there's still a chance that we see Brown as an every down player with a healthy wide receiver core. He's played great. The Texans could reward him. And for the record, in the fantasy playoffs, Houston does get Tennessee twice. They're a plus matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So I think it's fine to just sit back and hold Noah Brown and hope that this continues to some degree. Add Michael Wilson. So this is yet another repeat transaction. I've talked about adding Michael Wilson because of Kyler Murray returning to that Arizona Cardinals lineup. And if you didn't get him, it's not too late. He's still available in 88% of Yahoo leagues. But Wilson saw a 19.4% target share in week 10 against Atlanta. And I think that's noteworthy. It was his first game with Kyler Murray. He had 6 targets, he caught 3 of them for 34 yards, and he almost scored a touchdown. And Kyler Murray looked good. This whole passing attack has intriguing rest of season upside. The Cardinals wideouts, though, they have the 9th best remaining schedule by adjusted fantasy points allowed. And they've got the 5th best schedule in the fantasy playoffs. So I think Michael Wilson should be rostered in far more leagues. Buy Lamar Jackson. Listen, everyone, regression is coming for Lamar Jackson. He's averaged 12.2 points per game over his last 3 games. He's failed to hit 14 points in any of those contests. Before this stretch, he was averaging about 21 standard fantasy points per game. It's not time to panic. Baltimore has scored 11 offensive touchdowns over their last 3. That tells you that the offense is still moving the ball up and down the field. Unfortunately, only 2 of those touchdowns have come from Lamar Jackson's arm. Only 3 of them have come via the air. That means that the Ravens have seen a 27% pass-to-rush touchdown rate during this time. To give you some context, since 2011, the lowest pass-to-rush touchdown rate, it came from the Buffalo Bills in 2016. Their rate was 37%, significantly higher than what we're seeing from Baltimore right now. The Ravens have an above-average schedule for quarterbacks moving forward and in the fantasy playoffs. This might be the lowest to get Jackson all season long. Hold Keaton Mitchell. So regression is coming for Keaton Mitchell too. Over Mitchell's last 2 games, he's averaging a rushing touchdown for every 6 rush attempts. That's not sustainable, even if he's this big play running back with a lot of speed. And that's especially true because he's not the Ravens' goal line back. It's just not sustainable production overall. So why not consider him as a sell? Well, I think you technically could consider him a sell in some cases. Look, let me just break this down. This Keaton Mitchell breakout is a lot of fun. The main reason I think he's more of a hold here than a sell is because given what he's done, I do think Baltimore will reward him with more rush attempts, with more volume on the ground and through the air. He had just a 33% running back rush share in week 9, and then this past week it was 19%. He also played just 22% of Baltimore snaps this past week. those numbers feel like they're definitely going to rise. The issue that I'm having with Keaton Mitchell right now, and this is where the sell part comes into play, but it's that there are a lot of Keaton Mitchell truthers out there. We're already seeing comps to Devon Achane, talking about him being a league-winning player. There's nothing wrong with seeing that as a high-end outcome for Keaton Mitchell, but some fantasy managers are seeing that as fact. There are a lot of differences between Keaton Mitchell and Devon Achane. Achane was a better prospect. He can see goal line work in his offense. He's in a better run scheme. And he was seeing way better target shares than what Keaton Mitchell's been seeing. Like, I'm projecting more work for Keaton Mitchell moving forward. But what are the odds that he's seeing a significant snap share in that Baltimore backfield? Only 2 Baltimore Ravens running backs have hit a 70% snap share this year. Now, my guess is that your league mates are not willing to give up a true bell cow back or even a player like Devon Achane for Keaton Mitchell. If your best return is more of an RB3 type, maybe someone like Chuba Hubbard, I don't see the reason in getting rid of Keaton Mitchell for a player like Hubbard. If you can get a Rachaad White type, Isaiah Pacheco, a solid wide receiver too like Michael Pittman, that's where I'd be more than willing to trade Mitchell away. Add Rico Dowdle. So I talked about Rico Dowdle on last week's Sleeper Show as one of the better picks of the week. He ended up scoring almost 14 PPR points against the Giants. Now, he ended up seeing 43% of Dallas's running back rushes in that blowout against New York. That type of workload, probably not going to continue. Not without an injury to Tony Pollard. But there could be an injury to Tony Pollard. This is football that we're talking about. Injuries happen. This is the time of year where your bench can and should be used for some handcuffs. Because we have a better grasp of what teams look like and how they're managing their players now. There are fewer stashes in fantasy football, so we can use that bench real estate on higher upside handcuffs. And Dowdle is a higher upside handcuff. I know that Tony Pollard hasn't been converting. And for the record, I still do think that Pollard's a buy candidate, but that's for another show. Dallas is a top 10 rest of season running back schedule by adjusted fantasy points allowed. And here in week 11, you might be able to use Dowdle if you're in a pinch. They get Carolina. They're 10.5 point favorites right now. But this transaction is a reminder to get your handcuffs, even if you don't have the handcuff starter rostered on your team. Add Pat Freiermuth. So Pat Freiermuth is eligible to come off of IR this week. He's evidently close to returning to action. If he does go this week, you can't play him. They get Cleveland. Cleveland has been unreal against tight ends. Mark Andrews this year in 2 games has 124 receiving yards. Every other tight end combined against Cleveland has 80 receiving yards. After week 11, though, Freiermuth could be usable. He has 3 above average matchups in the fantasy playoffs, according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. I know that he didn't get off to a hot start this year, but we've seen him be reliable in the past. So why not throw that dart? Buy DK Metcalf. So there are times where I'll give some sort of recommendation on this show. It'll fail to come to fruition. And then readers and listeners, they'll ask me, is that still a transaction that you'd be making? When it comes to DK Metcalf, a couple of weeks ago, I called him a buy, and he is 100% still a buy candidate. Metcalf has not scored in 4 games, but he's seen a target share per game rate over this time of 28%. Based on where he's seeing his targets, he should have over 5 touchdowns this year. He scored twice. And aside from regression, part of the reason that he was featured as a buy candidate a couple of weeks ago is Seattle's schedule. Seahawks wide receivers have the number 1 schedule from now until the end of the season when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. And in the fantasy playoffs, they get the Eagles, the Titans, and the Steelers. Those are 3 teams who rank at the moment as top 5 favorable matchups for wide receivers. Process-wise, DK Metcalf is a very obvious buy candidate. Sell Kenneth Walker. Now on the flip side, the Seattle running back schedule, it's not as good as the wide receiver one. Now my original plan this week was to not have Kenneth Walker as a sell candidate. But then I sent a tweet out about Zach Charbonnet's uptick in usage over Seattle's last 3 games. And it was clear that there are people who are very, very high on Kenneth Walker. He's outsnapped Kenneth Walker in 3 consecutive games. And Walker, as a result, has seen target shares of just 5.6%, 8%, and 4.8%. Walker's running fewer routes than he was to start the season. Earlier this year, his route participation closer to 45%. Over the last 3 weeks, it's been 25%. And Walker's running back rush share numbers have dropped too. They've been 69% over his last 3 games on average. Before that, it was around 80%. Now, these might seem like small percentages, and I understand that Kenneth Walker's been a little bit banged up too, but they can be the difference between an RB1 and an RB2 in fantasy football. Because what happens when Seattle hits a negative game script? What happens if Kenneth Walker doesn't hit one of those iconic big touchdowns? Because that's what happened in week 10. Walker carried the ball 19 times for 63 yards. That's totally fine. But he caught only one pass. That one pass happened to go for a 64-yard touchdown. And yeah, I understand you guys. That's Walker's game. You get big plays with Kenneth Walker. He's been doing that since college, probably before college, I would assume. But I don't love relying on that kind of production, especially because he has a bottom 10 schedule by adjusted fantasy points allowed from here on out. The Seahawks get the Rams this week, and then they get the 49ers, Cowboys, 49ers, Eagles, and Titans. None of those teams are top half matchups for running backs by adjusted fantasy points allowed. If someone in your league is valuing Kenneth Walker as like a top 8 running back or so moving forward, I think that's when you can sell. He can and will still be valuable moving forward. That's not what I'm saying here. He's going to have those weeks where he makes some big plays, and he's still the goal line back too. He's going to score some touchdowns. My point here is that even though Seattle wants to feed him the rock, Zach Charbonnet seeing an uptick in snap share, that has limited the amount of groundwork that Kenneth Walker might see. And it's definitely limited his receiving upside. So when you combine that with the schedule, I do think that there's a chance in your league that Kenneth Walker's a sell candidate. Buy James Conner. So James Conner returned to action in week 10. He had that IR stint. He walked away with just 7.3 PPR points. But that's what makes him a really intriguing buy low. He didn't see a target in Arizona's game against Atlanta. That's somewhat of a concern. His route participation was actually only 38%. We'd like that number to get over 50%. But with that being said, it's not like other running backs were running routes ahead of James Conner. No Arizona Cardinals running back saw a target in that game. Conner led that backfield in routes run. And we can't lose sight of the fact that it was Conner's first game back from injury. There's room for improvement as a pass catcher. And he's shown us in the past that he can be a pass catcher. And he's got the ground game stuff on lock. He saw 84% of Arizona's running back rushes on Sunday. And moving forward, Arizona has a pretty nice running back schedule, at least by adjusted fantasy points allowed. They do have 2 tough games against the 49ers and Eagles, but those are the only 2 matchups that are kind of scary on their schedule. You're doing a little bit of projecting with Conner's receiving work. There's a chance that this coaching staff doesn't want to use him in that way. But we've seen him be a bell cow in the past. He's got a shot to finish this season strong. Hold Dak Prescott. So if you have Dak Prescott, you've probably won a lot of fantasy matchups over the last month. He's averaging almost 30 standard fantasy points per game over his last 4 games. That number was 11.8 across his first 5. Now, schedule has played a role in this. That's what I talked about actually on this show before week 6. Prescott has faced the 1st, 2nd, 14th, and 18th best opponents for quarterbacks in adjusted fantasy points allowed during this 4-game stretch. So you're probably thinking, oh, then I should probably sell him high. But here's the thing. Dallas's schedule, it's still really good moving forward. Their rest of season schedule is 3rd best in the league. They've got the Panthers, Commanders, Seahawks, Eagles, Bills, Dolphins, and Lions through the end of the fantasy season. Not only are those pretty easy opponents on paper, but there's potential shootouts there. You got games against the Eagles, Bills, Dolphins, and Lions. Those are potential shootouts. So I think this Cowboys passing attack is here to stay. Buy Josh Downs. So one of the sneakier buys this week that I think you can make, in my eyes at least, is with Josh Downs. The Colts are on a buy. Any Downs manager, they may be willing to give him away at a slight discount. He's also coming off a game where he saw just an 11.5% target share and he scored only 6 PPR points. But as many of you know, he's been dealing with his knee injury. He only ran 12 routes against the Patriots. He saw 3 targets on those 12 routes. So his targets per route run rate wasn't that bad despite the fact that he wasn't fully 100%. With the bye, Downs can heal up now and be closer to 100% for the rest of the season. And the rest of the season should be favorable for him. Colts wide receivers have the 6th best schedule by adjusted fantasy points allowed from now through the end of the year. And the short term is really, really nice. They get the Bucs, Titans, Bengals, and Steelers out of their bye. 3 of those teams rank as top 5 favorable matchups for wide receivers in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So it's a weirder transaction, but it's one that makes plenty of sense to me. Add Jordan Love. So we saw a little bit more life from Jordan Love this past week against the Steelers. He had 16.7 standard fantasy points. That was his highest output since week 4. But in reality, for as bad as Love has been at times this year, he's been fine enough as a streaming quarterback. He's dipped below 13.8 points just once this season. In week 11, the Packers get the Chargers. No team has allowed more adjusted points to quarterbacks this season than LA. When quarterbacks have faced the Chargers this year, they've scored 4.4 more points than their season-long average. Love is still out there in about 60% of Yahoo leagues. If you need a quarterback this week, I think that he works. Add the Washington Commanders defense. Tommy DeVito has thrown 20 or more passes in 2 games this year. Week 9 and Week 10, matchups against the Raiders and the Cowboys. In those 2 games, the Giants have allowed 13 sacks and they've thrown 3 interceptions. Washington is up next. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Greatly appreciated as always. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trend Show.